The engagement shattered at dinner. By dawn, Eleanor Coleman had vanished. By first light, the most feared man in England stood at her abandoned doorstep. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The February night settled over Coleman Street like a shroud, turning the elegant townhouses into monuments of shadow and ice. Inside number 14, the dinner meant to celebrate Eleanor Coleman's approaching wedding had become a spectacle of slow suffocation. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across 50 guests who pretended not to notice what was happening at the head table. Eleanor sat perfectly still in her pearl-grey gown, her hands folded in her lap, desperately wishing she could simply cease to exist. "My dear Miss Coleman," Charles Anderson's voice cut through the polite murmur of conversation, pitched just loud enough to command attention. "Surely you cannot have forgotten our discussion about appropriate conduct. I had hoped tonight might demonstrate your improved judgment." He smiled at their guests, a smile that never reached his eyes, and placed his hand over hers with calculated tenderness. His fingers tightened in warning. Eleanor felt 50 pairs of eyes turn toward her, felt the weight of expectation pressing down like stone. Her mother's emerald ring, the only piece of jewelry that still felt like her own, dug into her finger beneath Charles's grip. "I'm afraid I don't take your meaning, Mr. Anderson," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I've conducted myself with nothing but propriety." "Have you?" Charles leaned closer, his voice dropping to an intimate register that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Then perhaps you can explain your recent independence, the charity visits without chaperone, the correspondence I've discovered, the unseemly interest in matters beyond a woman's sphere." The room fell silent. Forks paused mid-air. Wine glasses hovered near lips. Lady Pemberton's fan stopped moving. Eleanor recognized the trap immediately. To defend herself would validate his accusations. To remain silent would confirm guilt. Charles had choreographed this moment perfectly. The public humiliation designed to remind her, and everyone present, exactly who held power in their union. She withdrew her hand from beneath his. "I see no reason to justify kindness, correspondence with my late mother's friends, or the use of my own mind," Eleanor said quietly. "If these things trouble you, Mr. Anderson, perhaps we should discuss them privately." "There's nothing to discuss." Charles's mask of concern slipped, revealing something harder beneath. "I simply cannot comprehend why a woman in your position would risk scandal mere weeks before securing her future. Unless, of course, you wish to remain unmarried, dependent, and increasingly irrelevant." The word hung in the air like toxic substance. Eleanor felt the room's sympathy curdle into judgment. She saw it in the sidelong glances, the pursed lips, the way Mrs. Hartwell whispered to her daughter behind a raised napkin. Society had already decided a woman who provoked such public correction must deserve it. Her throat tightened. Her vision blurred at the edges, but she would not cry, not here, not for them. "Excuse me," Eleanor whispered, rising from her chair with mechanical precision. "I find I'm unwell." She walked toward the door, each step measured, her spine straight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Behind her, Charles' voice rose in mock concern. "My dear, you mustn't be hasty." But she was already gone. The entrance hall was blessedly empty, bitterly cold. Eleanor's maid had disappeared, likely sent away by Charles earlier. No one would follow her. No one would check if she was truly unwell. They were too busy discussing what her behavior meant, what Charles would do, whether the engagement could possibly survive such unseemly defiance. Eleanor knew with sudden, crystalline clarity. The engagement was already dead. Charles had murdered it tonight with precision and witnesses. What remained was only the question of how thoroughly he would bury her reputation alongside it. She moved through the shadowed house as if in a dream, climbing the stairs to her room, the walls closing in around her. Her engagement ring, Charles's ring, heavy gold studded with diamonds she'd never wanted, sat on her dressing table. She stared at it as lamplight from the street below flickered through the window. Outside, the night pressed against the glass. Inside, her future had just been sealed and signed by a man who would spend their marriage punishing her for every breath she took without permission. Eleanor touched the cold window pane and felt the frost bite her fingertips. She could stay, she could apologize, she could spend tomorrow mending what Charles had deliberately torn, could wear contrition like a wedding veil, could step into a marriage that would erase her one careful word at a time. Or she could leave. The thought arrived without fanfare, without drama. Simple, impossible, inevitable. Eleanor turned from the window and began to pack. She worked quickly, methodically, in the lamp-lit silence. A small leather valise, her mother's, worn soft with age. 2 dresses, practical and dark. Her mother's letters, tied with ribbon, the small inheritance her father couldn't touch. Her mother's emerald ring, slipped from her finger and tucked into her bodice. Charles' engagement ring remained on the table. Let him interpret that however he wished. The city bells tolled 3 o'clock. Downstairs, she heard the last guests departing, their laughter sharp in the frozen air. Soon the house would sleep. Soon Charles would return to his own residence, confident that morning would bring Eleanor's inevitable surrender. He would be wrong. At 4:30, Eleanor descended the servants' stairs for the last time. The kitchen was dark, the scullery cold. She paused at the service entrance, her hand on the latch, and felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She would be ruined. She would be alone. She would have no protection, no position, no future that society would recognize. But she would be free. Eleanor stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. Coleman Street was silent save for the distant clop of hooves and the creak of early delivery carts. Fog rolled through the narrow lane, thick and bitter cold, turning the gas lamps into ghosts of light. The air smelled of coal smoke and river water and the sharp, clean promise of winter morning. A hired cab waited at the corner, arranged yesterday through a maid she'd paid handsomely for discretion. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and the sense not to ask questions, helped her inside without a word. Eleanor pulled her cloak tight and sat in the darkness, her valise at her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. The carriage lurched forward. Coleman Street began to recede. She pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching number 14 disappear into the fog. She thought of her mother, who had died quietly in that house. Her spirit dimmed year by year until nothing remained but obedience. She thought of the girl she'd been 6 months ago, who had said yes to Charles Anderson because everyone told her she should be grateful. That girl was gone now, left behind with the engagement ring and the future everyone had planned for her. Eleanor closed her eyes and felt the carriage carry her toward something unknown. Behind her, the house stood empty. The ring gleamed on the dressing table, and outside, the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the fog. By the time the city began to wake, servants lighting fires, merchants setting up stalls, society stirring in their silk-sheeted beds, Eleanor Coleman had vanished completely. But at number 14 Coleman Street, as the fog began to thin and the gas lights guttered out, a new carriage arrived. It was black, unmarked, pulled by 2 matched greys. The driver wore no livery. The door bore no crest, but every servant on the street recognized power when they saw it rolling past. The carriage stopped before number 14. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the door opened, and a man stepped down into the frost-rimed street. Jeff Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshire, did not knock. He did not announce himself. He simply stood before Eleanor Coleman's door as the first light of morning touched the rooftops and the whole street held its breath. No one had seen the Duke in London for 3 years. No one expected him in a respectable neighborhood at dawn, and no one, not the servants peering from windows, not the early risers hurrying past, not Charles Anderson sleeping soundly in his own bed, understood yet what his arrival meant. But they would. The Duke's grey eyes swept the empty street, paused on the darkened windows of number 14 and narrowed. Then he raised his hand and knocked once, sharp, authoritative, final as a judge's gavel. Inside the house, the sound echoed through empty rooms. Eleanor's maid, trembling, opened the door, and Jeff Blackwood stepped inside to find what Eleanor Coleman had left behind, and to ensure that what came next would not be decided by men like Charles Anderson, but by the woman who had disappeared into the dawn. To understand why the Duke arrived that morning, why he came for a woman society had already begun to whisper about, a woman who had vanished rather than submit, one must look back 7 months to a summer evening at Ravenshire Estate and a moment of quiet integrity that neither Eleanor nor Jeff had forgotten. 7 months earlier, Charles Anderson had been different, or perhaps Eleanor had simply been more willing to believe the version of himself he'd chosen to present. "You have the most remarkable mind, Miss Coleman," he'd said that first afternoon in her father's drawing room, his admiration seemingly genuine. "It's rare to find a woman who reads philosophy. Refreshing, even." Eleanor had smiled, cautious but hopeful. Her mother had been dead only 4 months. The house felt hollow. Charles's attention felt like sunlight breaking through grief's fog. Within weeks, the admiration had shifted. "Perhaps something lighter than Locke," he'd suggested, removing the book from her hands during his second visit. "Political theory can be rather taxing. I shouldn't want you to strain yourself." Then came the engagement, her father's relief palpable. Society's approval swift, and Charles's visits became instructions. "Your correspondence with Mrs. Ashworth must cease. A widow of questionable reputation is no fit companion for my future wife. The charity work in Whitechapel, absolutely not. Those neighborhoods are dangerous, Eleanor. I forbid it. Must you mention your mother so frequently? It casts a melancholy shadow. People will think you unstable." Each prohibition arrived wrapped in concern, delivered with that same smile that had once seemed kind. Eleanor had complied at first, believing compromise was love's currency, but Charles's ledger only ever recorded debts. Her grief became excessive. Her intelligence became unfeminine. Her inheritance, modest though it was, became our future, requiring his management, his approval, his signature on every decision. Eleanor had kept a journal once, recording her thoughts on literature, politics, the small observations that made life vivid. Charles found it during a visit, read it without permission, and burned it in her father's fireplace. "A married woman has no need for secrets," he'd said, watching the pages curl and blacken. "Your thoughts should be shared with your husband, not hidden in books." That night, Eleanor began writing again, but this time in cipher, in margins, in places Charles would never think to look. She continued her charity visits by lying about her destinations. She maintained friendships through clandestine letters. She withheld obedience in 1,000 small ways that Charles never quite caught but always suspected. The engagement became a siege. Charles, the patient general. Eleanor, the city slowly starving. She understood. Finally, what marriage to him would mean, not partnership, but erasure. Not love, but ownership. Her name would remain, but everything that made Eleanor would be methodically dismantled, brick by brick, until only an acceptable shell remained. On the night of the dinner, after the humiliation, after the guests departed, Eleanor sat alone in her darkened room and heard London beyond her window, carriages rattling past, A woman's distant laughter, the bells of St. Mary's tolling midnight. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and made her choice. She would not be erased. Not by Charles, not by society, not by anyone. Tomorrow she would disappear. The hours between decision and departure felt both eternal and impossibly brief. Eleanor moved through her room like a ghost rehearsing its own funeral. The leather valise, her mother's, soft with age and memory, lay open on the bed. She folded 2 plain dresses, dark wool that wouldn't draw attention. Her mother's letters, the inheritance documents her father couldn't legally withhold. A small purse of coins saved from household allowances Charles never thought to monitor. Her hands trembled only once when she removed her mother's emerald ring, the single piece of jewelry that had ever meant anything, and slipped it into her bodice, close to her heart. Charles's engagement ring remained on the dressing table, diamonds catching the lamplight like accusations. She didn't leave a note. The ring said everything that needed saying. At 4:30, Eleanor descended the servants' stairs for the last time, her footsteps silent on worn stone. The kitchen was dark, the household sleeping. She paused at the service door, her gloved hand on the cold latch, and felt the weight of the threshold she was about to cross. Beyond this door, ruin, obscurity, poverty, perhaps danger. Behind her, suffocation disguised as security. Erasure wrapped in propriety. A future that would consume her one breath at a time. Her fingers tightened on the latch. Outside, fog had transformed Coleman Street into something unrecognizable. The gas lamps bled amber through the grey, and the cobblestones gleamed with frost. The hired cab waited at the corner, arranged through a maid who'd asked no questions for enough coin, its horse stamping quietly in the cold. Eleanor walked toward it, each step deliberate, final. The fog swallowed the sound. The city slept on, unknowing. The driver, older with weathered hands and kind eyes, helped her inside without speaking. He understood discretion. Perhaps he'd seen this before. Women disappearing before dawn, women choosing uncertainty over certainty's slow death. The carriage door closed with a soft click. Eleanor sat in the darkness, her valise pressed against her knees, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Through the window, she watched number 14 recede into the fog, the house that had held her mother's last breath, her own last hope of being known. The carriage lurched forward, and London began to move past in shadows and silence. Fear coursed through her, cold and electric, but beneath it, something else, a fierce, bright relief that felt almost like joy. She had no plan beyond survival, no destination beyond a way. No certainty except this. She would rather face the unknown alone than face Charles Anderson every morning for the rest of her life. The fog pressed against the windows. Dawn was coming, pale and tentative, somewhere beyond the grey. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the city carry her toward whatever freedom looked like. Behind her, number 14 Coleman Street stood empty. The engagement ring caught the first light of morning, diamonds turning the color of ice. The house held its breath. And outside, as the city began to wake, the fog slowly lifted, revealing nothing but absence where Eleanor Coleman had been. Charles Anderson received the news at breakfast, delivered by Eleanor's ashen-faced maid along with his morning correspondence. "Gone, sir. Vanished sometime before dawn. Her bed wasn't slept in. And... stop." Charles set down his coffee with deliberate calm, though something cold and sharp twisted in his chest. Not grief, not concern, calculation. He dismissed the maid and sat in silence, fingers drumming against the mahogany table. Eleanor had actually done it. The little fool had run. His first thought was not where she'd gone, but who might know she had left. Within the hour, Charles was dressed and moving through London with practiced efficiency. His calls began at Lady Pemberton's, she who thrived on gossip and wielded it like currency. A terrible shock, Lady Pemberton. I'm quite beside myself. He arranged his features into appropriate distress. Miss Coleman has always been fragile, you understand. Since her mother's death, her nerves have been unreliable. Last night's outburst was merely the culmination of weeks of concerning behavior. Lady Pemberton leaned forward, eyes bright with interest. Unreliable, you say? I've tried to be patient, discreet, but the letters she's been writing, to unsuitable persons, I'm told. The charity work in dangerous neighborhoods. Her physician warned me only last week about her melancholic tendencies. Each lie landed smooth as silk. I fear she may have done something rash. How dreadful for you, Mr. Anderson. Indeed, though naturally I hope she'll be found safe. If anyone has seen her, they must inform me immediately. For her own protection, you understand. The visits continued. Lord Hartwell, Mrs. Ashworth, 3 prominent members of Parliament. Charles deployed the same careful narrative. Eleanor, unbalanced. Eleanor, emotional. Eleanor, in need of protection from her own instability. By noon, the story was spreading like ink in water. But beneath Charles's controlled exterior, anxiety gnawed. Eleanor knew things about his debts, his manipulations, the lengths he'd gone to secure her inheritance. If she spoke, if she found someone who would actually listen. He returned to his study and unlocked the drawer containing Eleanor's letters, the ones he'd confiscated, the journal pages he'd saved, documentation of her melancholic episodes, he'd call them. Evidence of instability, should anyone question his version of events. His hands shook slightly as he sorted through them. He needed her found, needed her silenced, or better yet, brought back thoroughly discredited. Needed... A knock interrupted his thoughts. His manservant entered, face pale. Sir, there's been a development at Miss Coleman's residence. What development? A visitor, sir. Arrived at dawn, I'm told. Still there, asking questions. The servant swallowed. It's the Duke of Ravenshire. The paper slipped from Charles's fingers. Jeff Blackwood. The Duke who hadn't been seen in London for 3 years. The Duke whose political influence could destroy careers with a word. The Duke whose very presence asked questions Charles could not afford to have answered. What the hell? Charles whispered. Is he doing there? The fog had not yet lifted when Jeff Blackwood's unmarked carriage stopped before number 14 Coleman Street. No crest adorned the door, no livery dressed the driver, but power, true power, needed no announcement. The Duke stepped down into the frost-rimed morning, his grey eyes sweeping the empty street with the precision of a man who missed nothing. 3 years absent from London, and still the city recognized him. Servants peering from windows, early risers hurrying past with averted gazes, the very air seeming to hold its breath. Jeff knocked once. Sharp. Final. Eleanor's maid opened the door, her face pale as parchment. Your Grace, we weren't expecting... No one ever is. Jeff stepped inside without waiting for invitation. Where is Miss Coleman's room? She's gone, Your Grace. Vanished in the night, and Mr. Anderson has already been notified. I didn't ask about Anderson. Jeff's voice remained quiet, but something in it made the maid's protests die unspoken. The room. Now. She led him upstairs, trembling. Eleanor's chamber was eerily untouched, bed made, curtains drawn against the morning light. But Jeff saw immediately what others might miss. The empty space on the dressing table where a jewelry box should sit. The slight disarray of the wardrobe, suggesting careful selection rather than panicked flight. And there, catching the pale light from the window, the engagement ring, left deliberately, positioned precisely. A statement rendered in gold and diamonds. Jeff picked it up, turning it slowly in his fingers. Heavy, expensive, utterly wrong for the woman who'd worn it. He remembered Eleanor Coleman from a summer evening 7 months past, at a garden party he'd attended only to secure a political alliance. He'd overheard two gentlemen discussing a scandal that would have destroyed his parliamentary efforts. Lies, but convincing ones. Eleanor had been standing nearby, close enough to hear every damning word. Later, others had asked what she'd overheard. She'd smiled politely and said she'd heard only talk of the weather. Jeff had watched her lie with such graceful conviction that even he had almost believed her. She'd saved his position with a kindness she'd had no obligation to offer. He'd made note of her name, her integrity, her quiet courage. And now she'd vanished, and vultures like Anderson were already circling. Jeff set the ring down and descended the stairs to find the household staff gathered in the entrance hall, anxious and uncertain. "Miss Coleman left of her own accord," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "She's not lost. She's not unstable. She's not to be discussed as though she were either. If Mr. Anderson or anyone else attempts to suggest otherwise, you will inform me immediately." He handed his card to the housekeeper, unmarked save for an address in Mayfair. "Your Grace," the maid ventured, "Mr. Anderson said she was unwell, that we should—" "Mr. Anderson," Jeff interrupted softly, "is not your concern. I am." His grey eyes swept the room. "I will personally oversee this matter. Miss Coleman will be found, and when she is, she will be protected. Is that understood?" Silence, then slowly, nods. Jeff stepped back into the fog-shrouded morning, his mind already working. Eleanor Coleman had disappeared to survive. Now he would ensure she survived what came next. Eleanor arrived in Bath 3 days after leaving London, travelling by stages under the name Mrs. Grey. A widow, she told curious innkeepers, seeking quiet recuperation after illness. The lie came easier than she'd expected. Perhaps because it was, in its way, true. She took lodgings in a modest boarding house on Trim Street, far from the fashionable crescents where society took the waters. Her room was small, cold, and blessedly her own. No one monitored her correspondence, no one questioned her reading material, no one told her when to speak or what to think. The first morning, Eleanor woke at dawn and simply sat by the window, watching the street below. A woman carrying bread, a man leading a horse. Ordinary lives, unmarked by scrutiny. She cried then, surprised by the force of her relief. Money proved the immediate concern. Her modest inheritance would sustain her for months, perhaps a year if she were careful. But careful meant invisible, and invisibility required purpose. Eleanor found work through the boarding-house keeper, mending fine linens for a dressmaker, transcribing letters for a retired clergyman whose hands shook with age. The work was humble, anonymous, and entirely hers to accept or refuse. Such small freedoms, choosing her own breakfast, walking without destination, reading philosophy at midnight if she pleased. She began to remember who she'd been before Charles, before grief, before the slow erasure of self. After 2 weeks, whispers reached Bath. A scandal in London, a broken engagement, a disappeared gentlewoman, rumours of instability. Eleanor heard them in the lending library, saw them in the careful glances of other lodgers. Mrs. Hartwell, the boarding-house keeper, appeared at her door one evening. "There's talk, Mrs. Grey, about a Miss Coleman from London. Peculiar coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Eleanor met her eyes steadily. "I wouldn't know, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm afraid society gossip has never interested me." A long pause. Then Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. "Just so. I've always thought a woman's past is her own business, provided she pays her rent promptly." Eleanor did pay promptly, and continued her work, and refused every internal urge to defend herself against accusations she would never hear directly. Charles wanted her to return, chastened, grateful, properly broken. Society expected contrition, explanation, submission. Eleanor offered none of it. She walked through Bath streets with her head high, answering to a name that was both false and more honest than the one she'd left behind. She was not Miss Coleman anymore, that frightened girl in a gilded cage. She was something else now. Something still forming. But one afternoon, returning from the dressmaker's shop, Eleanor noticed a man across the street. Well-dressed, watchful, his attention too focused to be coincidental. She turned a corner quickly, heart racing. When she glanced back, he was gone. Eleanor stood in the shadowed alley, breathing hard, and understood with cold clarity. Obscurity was not the same as safety. Someone was looking for her. Jeff Blackwood spent 3 days methodically dismantling Charles Anderson's carefully constructed narrative. It began with Eleanor's maid who, under the Duke's steady, patient questioning, admitted that Mr. Anderson had confiscated Miss Coleman's correspondence, that he'd forbidden her charity work, that the concerning behavior he'd described to society consisted primarily of reading philosophy and maintaining friendships he disapproved of. "He burned her journal, Your Grace," the girl whispered. Right in front of her, said a married woman had no need for secrets. Jeff's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his chest. He interviewed the housekeeper, the footman, Eleanor's former companion. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. Control disguised as concern, isolation framed as protection. Charles's grip tightening incrementally until Eleanor had nowhere left to breathe. On the 4th day, Jeff summoned Charles to his Mayfair residence. Anderson arrived dressed for social battle. Confident smile, practiced charm. But when he entered Jeff's study and found himself facing not drawing-room civility but cold interrogation, his composure began to fracture. "I don't understand this interest in Miss Coleman, Your Grace. She suffered a nervous collapse, nothing more. When she's found, she'll require, Jeff interrupted quietly, "protection from you." Charles's smile tightened. "I'm her betrothed. Who better to—" "You were her betrothed." Past tense. Jeff placed a stack of papers on the desk between them. Testimony from servants, copies of confiscated letters, a detailed account of the dinner party. Humiliation. You isolated her, controlled her, systematically destroyed her confidence and autonomy. And when she finally escaped, you spread lies about her mental stability to prevent anyone from believing her side of the story. Those aren't lies. Eleanor is unstable. Eleanor Coleman, Jeff said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Once saved my political career by refusing to repeat a damaging rumor when doing so would have cost her nothing. She chose integrity over gossip, kindness over advantage. That is who she is, Anderson. And you tried to break her because you couldn't control her. Charles stood abruptly. You can't prove any of this. I don't need to prove it. I simply need to ensure you never get near her again. Something shifted in Charles's expression. Desperation replacing calculation. If she's told you things, if she's trying to destroy my reputation, she's told me nothing. She doesn't even know I'm looking for her. Jeff met his eyes. But you just revealed exactly how dangerous you are. A man who fears a woman's voice is a man capable of silencing it permanently. Charles left minutes later, his composure in ruins. Jeff stood at the window, watching the street below. His instincts, honed by years in Parliament's darker corridors, whispered warnings. Desperate men made reckless choices. An hour later, his investigator arrived with news. Bath, Your Grace. A Mrs. Gray matching Miss Coleman's description, staying on Trim Street. Jeff was already reaching for his coat. Charles Anderson's world began to collapse 3 days after Jeff Blackwood left for Bath. Lady Pemberton, who had so eagerly spread Charles's narrative of Eleanor's instability, received a visit from the Duke's secretary. The conversation was brief, factual, devastating. Servant's testimony. Documented isolation, the burned journal, the confiscated letters. By evening, Lady Pemberton was revising her opinions at every drawing room in Mayfair. Within 48 hours, society's tide had turned. Charles found doors closed, invitations withdrawn, conversations ending when he entered rooms. The whispers now focused not on Eleanor's supposed madness, but on his cruelty, his control, his lies. He sent increasingly desperate letters to Bath, but Eleanor never received them. Mrs. Hartwell, protective of her quiet lodger, burned each one unopened. In Bath, Eleanor was returning from the lending library when she saw the unmarked carriage outside her boarding house. Black, elegant, utterly out of place on modest Trim Street, her heart stopped. Mrs. Hartwell met her at the door, face grave. "There's a gentleman asking for you." Mrs. Gray, or should I say Miss Coleman. He knows who you are, says his name is Blackwood. The Duke of Ravenshire. Here. For her. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities, each more alarming than the last. Had her father sent him? Had Charles somehow— "He's waiting in the parlour," Mrs. Hartwell continued gently. "But you needn't see him if you don't wish it. I can send him away." Eleanor straightened her spine. She'd spent 3 weeks building a life from nothing. She would not cower now. "No, I'll see him." Jeff stood when she entered, and Eleanor's first thought was that he looked nothing like she'd expected. No aristocratic hauteur, no visible judgment. Just a tall man with grey eyes that assessed her with unsettling precision. "Miss Coleman, thank you for seeing me. You've given me little choice, Your Grace. You know where I am. You know my assumed name." Eleanor kept her voice steady. "What do you want?" "To ensure you're safe." "I'm safe. I'm also free, anonymous, and determined to remain so. If you've come to return me to London—" "I haven't." Jeff gestured to a chair. "May we speak plainly?" Eleanor sat, wary. Jeff remained standing as if understanding that looming would only reinforce the power imbalance between them. "Charles Anderson has been spreading lies about your mental state," he said quietly. "I've spent the past week ensuring those lies are corrected. Society now knows the truth of what he did to you, but Anderson himself is growing desperate, which makes him dangerous." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "Why would you involve yourself in this?" "Because 7 months ago you protected me when you had no obligation to do so. You heard a rumor that would have destroyed my political standing, and you chose silence. I don't forget such deaths." She remembered. The garden party, the overheard conversation, the careful lie she'd told to preserve his reputation. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, just kindness, reflexive as breathing. "That was nothing," she said. "It was integrity, the same integrity Anderson tried to erase." Jeff's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You left London to survive. I merely want to ensure you can continue surviving, on your terms, not anyone else's." Eleanor studied him, searching for manipulation, for hidden demands. Found only steady patience. "I won't return to society," she said finally. "I won't answer their questions or justify my choices. I'm not asking you to. And I won't be rescued like some damsel requiring protection. You've already rescued yourself, Miss Coleman. I'm simply ensuring no one drags you back." Jeff paused. "What do you want? Not what you think you should want. What do you want?" The question, so simple, so rarely asked, made Eleanor's throat tighten. "Time," she whispered. "Time to decide who I am without someone else defining it for me." "Then that's what you'll have." Jeff moved toward the door, then stopped. "If you need anything, resources, information, intervention, you have only to send word. But the choice is yours, always." He left his card on the table, unmarked, except for an address. Eleanor sat alone in the quiet parlor, holding the card, and felt something shift in her chest. Not rescue, not obligation, recognition, respect, the rarest gift, being seen and allowed to simply be. Outside she heard his carriage depart, and for the first time since leaving London, Eleanor smiled. Spring arrived in Bath with unexpected gentleness, turning the grey city golden. Eleanor, still Mrs. Grey to her neighbours, still Miss Coleman in the quiet corners of her heart, watched the season change from her window on Trim Street. 6 weeks had passed since the Duke's visit, 6 weeks of careful rebuilding, of small choices accumulating into something resembling a life. News from London arrived in fragments, delivered through Mrs. Hartwell's carefully curated gossip. Charles Anderson had left the city. Quietly, quickly, his reputation in ruins. Whispers suggested debts, accusations from other women, the slow unraveling of a man who'd built his existence on control and discovered how fragile such foundations were. Some said he'd gone to the continent. Others claimed the north. Eleanor found she didn't care which. His absence was enough. Her name, she learned, had been quietly restored, not through dramatic proclamation, but through the Duke's methodical correction of every lie Charles had spread. Society now spoke of Eleanor with sympathy rather than scandal, though she had no intention of returning to test their revised opinions. Jeff had kept his word. He'd sent no demands, no summons. Only a brief letter stating that her father's house had been secured in her name, her inheritance protected, and that certain legal matters had been resolved to prevent future interference. The letter ended simply. The choice, as always, remains yours. Eleanor had written back, her first correspondence in months that wasn't a lie or evasion. She thanked him. She told him she would stay in Bath for now, perhaps longer. She admitted she was learning who she might become when no one was defining her but herself. His response had been a single line. "I look forward to meeting her." The words stayed with her, quiet and patient as spring rain. On a morning in late March, Eleanor woke early and dressed carefully, not in morning grey, but in pale blue, her mother's favourite colour. She walked through Bath streets as the city stirred to life, past the crescents where she'd never belonged, toward the river where light broke gold across the water. She carried nothing but a small notebook, not hidden, not secret, simply hers, and a future that remained blessedly uncertain. Somewhere in London, Jeff Blackwood attended Parliament, wielding power with the precision of a man who understood its proper use. Somewhere in Eleanor's past, Charles Anderson nursed his downfall, and somewhere ahead, possibilities waited like unopened doors. Eleanor paused at the river's edge, watching fog lift from the water. The same fog that had hidden her escape now dissolved in morning light, revealing not concealment, but clarity. She thought of the woman who'd fled Coleman Street before dawn, terrified, desperate, half-formed. That woman had been necessary. That woman had survived. But Eleanor was no longer running. She was walking, deliberately, towards something rather than away. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write. Not in cipher, not in margins, but in clear, unapologetic script. Her thoughts. Her observations, her own voice, finally unmuffled. A gentleman passed, tipped his hat. "Lovely morning, Mrs. Grey." "Indeed it is," Eleanor replied, smiling. Mrs. Grey, Miss Coleman. Perhaps someday simply Eleanor, defined by no title but her own choices. The fog cleared entirely. The river sparkled, and Eleanor turned toward the city. Not the London that had tried to cage her, but the Bath she was learning to call home, at least for now. Behind her, the past receded like morning mist. Ahead, the day waited, unwritten, and entirely hers. She walked toward it without hesitation, without fear, carrying nothing but possibility and the hard-won knowledge that freedom, once claimed, was a door that could never be fully closed again. The sun rose higher, the city awakened, and Eleanor Coleman stepped into a life she had chosen, one deliberate step at a time. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.